They survived longer without a homeland than Rome existed with one. And they did it using a system so effective that modern corporations, intelligence networks, and digital platforms are still copying it today. The mechanism that kept Jewish diaspora communities alive for 2,000 years was not faith, not tradition, and not luck. It was a distributed network architecture that predated the internet by millennia. A system of redundancy, information transfer, and mutual obligations so sophisticated that when historians finally mapped it in the 1990s, cybersecurity researchers immediately recognized the design principles. By the end of this documentary, you will understand the single structural innovation that made this possible. And you will see how it explains something happening right now, in 2026, that most analysts are completely misreading. Between 70 Common Era and 1948, Jewish communities existed without sovereignty, without an army, and without territorial control. They outlasted the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Third Reich. When the Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus in 70 Common Era, approximately 2.5 million Jews lived in Judea. By 1900, there were roughly 12 million Jews scattered across 6 continents. No other stateless population achieved this. The Assyrians, who were dispersed in 722 before Common Era, number fewer than 500,000 today. The Babylonians effectively vanished. The survival was not accidental. Let's begin. In the year 73 Common Era, 3 years after the fall of Jerusalem, a Roman military engineer named Marcus Vibius documented something unusual in a report to Governor Lucius Flavius Silva. Jewish refugees arriving in Alexandria were not destitute. They carried letters of credit, financial instruments recognized by merchant networks across the Eastern Mediterranean. These were not Roman instruments. They predated the dispersal. The letters referenced accounts in Babylon, in Damascus, in Antioch. The infrastructure was already in place before the temple fell. This was the first layer of the system, preemptive network construction. Jewish communities had been establishing diaspora nodes since the Babylonian exile in 586 before Common Era, 659 years before the Roman destruction. By the time Titus breached the walls of Jerusalem, there were established Jewish populations in at least 150 cities across the known world. This was not the result of persecution. It was strategic positioning. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled between 200 and 500 Common Era, contains detailed records of this network's financial operations. Tractate Bava Metzia describes a system called Iska, a hybrid loan partnership instrument that allowed capital to flow between communities while adhering to the prohibition on charging interest to fellow Jews. The mechanism was brilliant. Instead of a loan with interest, the transaction was structured as a partnership where the lender provided capital and the borrower provided labor, with profits split according to a predetermined formula. If the venture failed, losses were shared. This transformed every commercial transaction into a network bond. By 300 Common Era, rabbinic courts in Babylon were adjudicating disputes involving merchants in Gaul, modern France, over 3,000 miles away. The system required zero state enforcement. It ran on reputational incentive alone. A merchant who defaulted in Babylon would find himself unable to trade in Alexandria. The information traveled faster than he could. How fast? Letters from the Cairo Geniza, a repository of Jewish documents discovered in 1896, show that in the 11th century, commercial information traveled from Tunisia to India in approximately 90 days. News of a merchant's default in Fustat, Egypt, reached Calicut on the Malabar coast in less than 3 months. This was faster than most royal courier systems of the period. The network moved information about trust violations with the urgency usually reserved for military intelligence. The economist Avner Greif, in his 1989 paper analyzing the Geniza documents, identified what he called quote, _1___. Essentially, the diaspora communities operated as a distributed database of creditworthiness. The system had no central authority. The sanctions were enforced horizontally by mutual agreement among nodes. If you've never seen this story told this way, subscribe. More investigations like this every week. But the economic network was only the visible part. The real infrastructure, the one historians rarely discuss, was something else entirely. In the year 1144, the Jewish community of Norwich, England, faced an accusation of ritual murder, the first of the blood libel cases that would plague European Jewry for centuries. The local population rioted. 12 Jews were killed before the crown intervened. Within 6 weeks, every major Jewish community from Cologne to Cairo knew the details of the Norwich case. Not rumors, details. Names, dates, the specific allegations, the legal defense used, and the outcome. This was the information layer of the network, a continent-spanning intelligence system that operated through the vehicle of religious communication. Every synagogue maintained correspondence with multiple other synagogues. Rabbis exchanged responsa, questions and answers on points of Jewish law. These letters traveled with merchants, pilgrims, and itinerant scholars. The system was designed for religious purposes, but it transmitted everything. The Toledo Geniza fragments, analyzed by historians in 2008, revealed that a single responsum from Rabbi Moses ben Maimonides, written in Fustat in 1175, reached communities in Yemen, Iraq, France, and Spain within 18 months. The letter concerned a question of kashrut, Jewish dietary law. But embedded in the discussion were references to political conditions in Cairo, the status of Saladin's campaigns, and warnings about forced conversion attempts in the Maghreb. Every legal letter was also an intelligence report. The Ashkenazi communities of Northern Europe refined this into something more systematic. By the 13th century, they had established a formal network called the Quote Three, councils that coordinated responses to external threats. The Council of Four Lands in Poland-Lithuania, established in 1580, met twice yearly. Representatives from hundreds of communities gathered to share information, standardize responses to legal challenges, and coordinate emigration when necessary. The records of the Vaad, preserved in the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People in Jerusalem, show a level of coordination that resembled nothing so much as a distributed intelligence service. In 1648, when the Khmelnytsky uprising began in Ukraine, the Vaad had established refugee routes and designated safe communities in Hungary, Moravia, and the Ottoman Empire within 3 weeks of the first pogroms. Approximately 100,000 Jews were evacuated. The network activated before most European governments even knew the uprising had started. This was possible because of the third layer, the education infrastructure. Unlike any other population in the medieval world, Jewish communities maintained near-universal male literacy. The requirement to read Torah meant that even poor communities operated schools. By the 16th century, literacy rates among Jewish males in Central Europe exceeded 90%. Among the general population, literacy rarely exceeded 15%. This had a strategic consequence that rabbis probably never intended. It meant the entire male population could participate in information transfer. A merchant could read a letter from another city and understand its contents. A refugee could carry written instructions and follow them. The network could operate at high bandwidth because the nodes were literate. The Sephardic expulsion from Spain in 1492 demonstrated the system under maximum stress. On the 31st of July, 1492, approximately 150,000 Jews were forced to leave Spain. They had 4 months' notice. By November, refugee communities had been established in Portugal, the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, Italy, and the Netherlands. The absorption was not chaotic. Communities in Salonika, Istanbul, and Izmir had prepared housing, arranged employment, and established credit facilities for the refugees before they arrived. How? The network had activated the moment the Alhambra Decree was signed. Letters went out from Spanish Jewish leaders to every major community in the Mediterranean. The requests were specific. Salonika, prepare for 15,000 refugees with backgrounds in textiles and metalwork. Istanbul, Prepare for 20,000, heavy concentration of physicians and translators. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II reportedly said, "You call Ferdinand a wise king, he who impoverishes his own country and enriches mine?" He was not wrong. The refugees brought skills, capital, and connections. But the real asset was the network itself. The Sephardic diaspora maintained its internal coherence. A merchant family that fled from Seville to Amsterdam could still do business with a cousin who went to Izmir. The bonds held across geography. Within 2 generations, the Sephardic trading network connected 4 continents. Families like the Mendez Nasi operated banking operations that financed Habsburg wars and Ottoman expansion simultaneously. They could do this because the trust architecture was already in place. That explains the network. But it raises a darker question. If this system was so effective, why did it fail so catastrophically in the 20th century? The answer lies in a structural change that most historians miss. The network was built for a medieval world, a world of slow-moving information, porous borders, and weak central states. It relied on 3 conditions: ability to exit threatened regions, the existence of refuge communities elsewhere, and the continuation of international trade routes that allowed information and people to flow. All 3 conditions began to erode in the 19th century with the rise of the modern nation-state. Borders hardened. Passports were introduced. States claimed monopolies on legal identity. The same year that marked the peak of Jewish success in Western Europe, 1871, when the German Empire granted full citizenship to Jews, was also the year that made the old network architecture obsolete. Consider the statistics. In 1800, a Jew fleeing persecution in one country could usually find refuge in another within weeks. By 1938, when Jews tried to flee Germany, they encountered a new reality. Immigration quotas, visa requirements, closed borders. The Evian Conference of July 1938, called to address the refugee crisis, involved 32 countries. 29 refused to accept significant numbers of Jewish refugees. Australia's representative said, quote, "The network still functioned for information transfer. Jewish communities worldwide knew about Kristallnacht within 48 hours, but it could no longer perform its core function, physical evacuation. The modern state had broken the exit valve. And yet, paradoxically, the network architecture survived the Holocaust and rebuilt itself in a new form. This is the part that almost no one analyzes correctly. In 1945, the global Jewish population had been reduced from 16.5 million to approximately 11 million, a loss of 5.5 million people, roughly 35% of the total population. The European Jewish communities that had formed the network's core were shattered. Poland, which had hosted 3.5 million Jews in 1939, had fewer than 300,000 survivors in 1945. The Lithuanian Jewish community, historically one of the most intellectually vibrant, producing a disproportionate number of Talmudic scholars and mathematicians, had been reduced from 240,000 to approximately 25,000. The conventional narrative treats 1948, the establishment of Israel, as a break with diaspora history. It was not. It was the network reasserting itself through a new node type, a sovereign territorial base that could guarantee refuge. The function remained identical to what the Ottoman Empire had provided for Sephardic refugees in 1492, or what Poland-Lithuania had provided for Ashkenazi refugees fleeing Western Europe in the 16th century. The difference was ownership. But here is what the conventional analysis misses. The diaspora network did not collapse into the Israeli node. It reorganized into a hub-and-spoke model. Israel became one hub, critical for its guarantee of refuge, but the United States became another, and smaller hubs emerged in France, the United Kingdom, Canada, Argentina, South Africa, and Australia. The economic coordination mechanisms adapted to modern technology almost immediately. The Israel Bonds Program, launched in 1951, raised over $52 billion between 1951 and 2020, most of it from diaspora communities. This was not charity. The bonds paid interest. They were financial instruments that channeled diaspora capital to the Israeli node, maintaining the diaspora's economic stake in that node's survival. It was ISKA updated for the 20th century. The information layer evolved even more radically. In the 1950s and 60s, Jewish diaspora organizations created what intelligence analysts would recognize as a distributed monitoring network. Organizations like the American Jewish Committee, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the Conseil représentatif des institutions juives de France, and dozens of others operated as regional nodes collecting information on anti-Semitic incidents, political developments affecting Jewish populations, and threats to Jewish communities worldwide. By the 1970s, these organizations were coordinating internationally. When the Soviet Union suppressed Jewish cultural and religious practice and restricted emigration, the Diaspora Network activated. The "Let My People Go" campaign, which pressured the USSR to allow Jewish emigration, was coordinated across multiple countries. American Jewish organizations lobbied the United States Congress, which tied Soviet trade status to emigration policy through the Jackson-Vanik Amendment in 1974. European Jewish organizations pressured their governments. Israeli intelligence services ran covert operations to facilitate escapes. Between 1968 and 1991, approximately 1.5 million Soviet Jews emigrated, most to Israel, many to the United States. The network had successfully extracted a major Jewish population from a hostile superpower during the Cold War. No other diaspora group achieved anything comparable. Everything described so far explains the survival. What it does not explain is how the same strategy was reverse-engineered, and by whom. That answer is buried in the final chapter of this story. In 1993, a researcher named Howard Rheingold published a book called The Virtual Community, Analyzing the Early Internet. He described how online networks created trust and cooperation among strangers through reputation systems and reciprocal exchange. He explicitly compared these mechanisms to the historical Jewish diaspora network, citing Avner Greif's work on the Maghrebi traders. The comparison was not metaphorical. The structural similarities were exact. Distributed nodes with no central authority, information flow creating mutual knowledge, reputational enforcement of norms, and resilience through redundancy. When one node failed, the network routed around it. By the late 1990s, Silicon Valley technologists were consciously studying diaspora network architecture. The design principles of peer-to-peer networks, blockchain systems, and federated platforms directly mirror the Jewish diaspora model. No single point of failure, cryptographic trust instead of institutional trust, and economic incentives aligned with network preservation. But the reverse engineering went beyond technology. In 2004, the United States military's Joint Special Operations University published a paper titled Networks and Net Wars, analyzing decentralized resistance movements. The paper dedicated an entire section to historical precedents for resilient stateless networks. The Jewish diaspora was case study number 1. The analysis noted, the network persisted for 2 millennia despite repeated attempts at suppression because it combined economic interdependence with cultural cohesion and distributed information systems. The same year, Al-Qaeda strategists were circulating an online document called Management of Savagery that explicitly advocated for a cell-based network structure with autonomous nodes linked by ideology and communication. The document's author, Abu Bakr Naji, wrote, __quote_11__. The irony is almost too perfect. A survival strategy developed by a persecuted minority to outlast hostile empires had become a template for non-state actors resisting modern states. The structure was value neutral. It worked for merchants in the 11th century, for resistance movements in the 20th century, and for cryptocurrency advocates in the 21st century. And this explains something happening right now that most analysts are completely misreading. When people discuss the resilience of certain diaspora communities today, whether Chinese business networks in Southeast Asia, Lebanese merchant families across West Africa, or Indian trading communities in East Africa, they often treat these as separate phenomena. They are not. They're all running versions of the same distributed network architecture that Jewish communities pioneered and refined over 2,000 years. The Chinese Huiguan system, regional associations that support Chinese immigrants abroad, operates on identical principles to the Jewish Vaad councils of the 16th century. The Hawala money transfer system used by South Asian and Middle Eastern communities is functionally equivalent to the Iska partnerships documented in the Talmud. The pattern repeats because the underlying logic is sound. If you lack state protection, you build a horizontal network that provides insurance, information, and enforcement through mutual obligation. Recent scholarship has started to quantify this. A 2018 study by economists Masayuki Kudamatsu and Valeria Rueda analyzed diaspora networks in sub-Saharan Africa. They found that ethnic groups with stronger diaspora networks, measured by the density of intercity commercial relationships and the frequency of information exchange, showed significantly higher economic resilience during political instability. When governments collapsed or civil wars erupted, these communities could evacuate capital and people more effectively. The effect size was large, approximately 30% higher survival rates for businesses embedded in strong networks versus isolated businesses. The researchers were measuring, without fully realizing it, the same mechanisms that allowed Jewish merchants to survive the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 10th century or the fragmentation of Poland in the 18th century. But there is a deeper pattern that historians are only beginning to recognize. The network architecture that enabled diaspora survival also had intellectual consequences. Communities that maintained high literacy rates, prioritized education, and engaged in constant long-distance information exchange developed what cognitive scientists call cultural metacognition, the ability to think about thinking, to analyze one's own cultural assumptions from an external perspective. This was not unique to Jewish communities, but it was pronounced. When you live in Babylon and correspond with relatives in Spain, you become aware that customs differ, that practices evolve, that traditions are not natural law but human constructions. The Talmud itself is a monument to this metacognitive approach. Thousands of pages of arguments where rabbis debate not just what the law is, but how to think about the law, how to interpret interpretation. The statistical consequence is measurable. Between 1870 and 1940, the 70 years when European Jews had largely achieved legal emancipation, but before the Holocaust, Jews constituted approximately 2% of the European population, but produced a wildly disproportionate number of major intellectuals. Of the 89 Germans who won Nobel Prizes in science before 1940, 14 were Jewish, roughly 16%. In Hungary, the disproportion was even more extreme. Jews were 5% of the population, but represented 20% of university students by 1920. The conventional explanations for this, discrimination pushing Jews into intellectual professions, or cultural emphasis on education, are true but incomplete. The network itself selected for certain cognitive traits. If your survival depends on maintaining relationships across language barriers, interpreting ambiguous signals from different cultural contexts, and making decisions with incomplete information, you are training pattern recognition and abstract reasoning. Remember the figure from earlier. 90% literacy rates among Jewish males in 16th century Central Europe versus 15% in the general population. That gap persisted for centuries. It meant that Jewish communities were running a multi-generational cognitive training program that prioritized textual analysis, logical argumentation, and information synthesis. The Nobel Prize statistics are not an accident. They are what you would predict from a population that spent 2 millennia optimizing for information processing and network maintenance. And this brings us to the present, to the mechanism that the hook promised to explain. The single innovation that made 2,000 years of stateless survival possible was not any specific institution. It was the recognition that resilience comes from redundancy, and that redundancy requires distribution. Every critical function, financial infrastructure, information transfer, education, legal authority, identity maintenance, was replicated across multiple nodes. No single node was indispensable. When Babylon declined, the center shifted to Spain. When Spain expelled its Jews, the center shifted to Poland and the Ottoman Empire. When Poland was partitioned and the Ottomans weakened, new centers emerged in Western Europe and the Americas. When Europe became a death trap, the network reconstituted itself in Israel and the United States. This is what modern systems designers call underscore underscore quote underscore 13 underscore underscore underscore, the property of growing stronger through stress. Networks that are merely robust resist shocks. Anti-fragile systems use shocks to reorganize more effectively. Every persecution that destroyed a node forced the network to develop new nodes in different locations, which increased geographic distribution and therefore increased resilience. The Assyrians and Babylonians did not survive their dispersals because they lacked this architecture. When their temple centers fell, they had no distributed network to fall back on. Their cultural transmission was centralized. When the center died, the periphery dissolved. The Jewish diaspora network survived because it was never truly centralized. Even when the temple stood in Jerusalem, the Babylonian Jewish community maintained its own scholars, its own academies, and its own authority structures. After 70 Common Era, this distribution became the primary mode of organization. And here is the contemporary application that almost everyone misses. We are living through a moment when centralized institutions are weakening globally. Nation-states are struggling to manage transnational challenges. International institutions lack enforcement power. Traditional media has fragmented. The conditions increasingly resemble those of the medieval period. Multiple competing centers of authority, porous jurisdictions, and rapid information flow that states cannot control. In this environment, the populations and organizations that will thrive are those that understand distributed network architecture. This is not speculation. It is already happening. Cryptocurrency communities, open-source software projects, transnational activist networks, and diaspora businesses all operate on the same principles that sustained Jewish communities for 2 millennia: redundancy, reputational enforcement, distributed authority, and cultural cohesion without territorial sovereignty. The Chinese Communist Party understands this, which is why it views overseas Chinese communities with such suspicion. The party knows that distributed networks with loyalties that cross borders represent a structural challenge to centralized state power. This is the same reason that European monarchies and the Russian Empire imposed restrictions on Jewish communities, not primarily because of religious hatred, but because the network model itself was incompatible with absolutist sovereignty. Modern authoritarian states face the same dilemma. They can attempt to suppress diaspora networks, but suppression activates the very resilience mechanisms that make the networks hard to kill. Every restrictive measure validates the network's core assumption: you cannot rely on state protection, so you must rely on horizontal bonds with your community. This dynamic is playing out across the world right now. Uyghur communities in exile are building exactly this kind of network: distributed fundraising, international advocacy coordination, cultural preservation initiatives that operate across borders. The same is true for Tibetan exile communities, Hong Kong diaspora activists, and numerous other groups. They are all, whether they realize it or not, implementing the Jewish diaspora playbook. When territorial sovereignty is impossible or denied, build a distributed network that provides the functions of sovereignty through coordination. The difference today is speed. What took centuries in the medieval period can happen in years or months with modern communications technology. A diaspora network that would have required generations to build and decades to coordinate can now be assembled in a fraction of the time. The underlying logic remains identical: distributed nodes, reputational bonds, information sharing, mutual aid. But the execution velocity has increased by orders of magnitude. This is what the future will look like for an increasing number of populations. Not territorial sovereignty, network sovereignty. The ability to maintain collective identity, coordinate action, and provide mutual protection without controlling territory. It is the oldest form of political organization, predating the modern state by millennia, and it is becoming relevant again. The Jewish diaspora experience is the longest-running test case of this model. 2,000 years, hundreds of locations, dozens of different legal and political contexts, multiple attempts at complete annihilation, and the network persisted. The mechanisms were tested under every possible stress condition and refined through each iteration. When Silicon Valley entrepreneurs talk about building resilient decentralized systems, when military strategists analyze networks and net wars, when social scientists study transnational communities, they are all studying variations of the same structure. Most of them do not realize they are looking at a model that has been running continuously since the Babylonian exile in 586 before Common Era. That is 2,612 years of operational history. No modern institution comes close. The survival was not miraculous. It was engineered. And engineering principles are now being copied by everyone who needs resilience in a world where centralized authority is fragmenting. The template is available. The question is, who will use it effectively, and who will fail to recognize the pattern until it is too late? The network endures because it was built to endure. 2,000 years of refinement through survival pressure produced a system optimized for one thing above all else: not victory, not dominance, but continuation. And in the long run, continuation is the only victory that matters.